Thanks so much, Andres. Let me start maybe with a big thank you to Andres and all the other organizers. It has been amazing 3 days. I learned a lot. I felt like I was in a crash course again on behavioral science. It makes it very hard to give a presentation now 3 days later because a lot of the things that I wanted to say are different now, three days into the conversation. Let me start with an anecdote. Andres introduced me with my academic title, which is actually very unusual for the United Nations. We're not asked to use our academic title on business cards or in the email footer, and that gives you a sense for how, from time to time, science is stripped away in the context of international organizations. So that's just something I wanted to share with you that I found very interesting. And at the same time, when you look at how the United Nations came about, there has been a lot of science driving the issue of disarmament, the issue of human development, and many other questions where art, science, and political issues came together. And I really enjoyed the conversation over the last 3 days, which was about interdisciplinary issues, because that pretty much speaks to my own history. I was trained as a lawyer, I worked as a lawyer, but then I also got trained as a mediation and conflict resolution specialist, where you necessarily take classes in psychology and in other issues related to human behavior. Now, what I wanted to do in my presentation is to take you on a quick journey with regard to 3 things. Why I think behavioral science matters in the context of international diplomacy. I'm going to say a few more words about that in a second, and what behavioral science can do for international diplomacy at large. And then a little bit from behind the scenes, what's actually happening when it comes to programmatic action on our end. Now, a little bit of context of where I come from. I work in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs in New York City, which is basically a part of the UN Secretariat. The UN comes in different forms and shapes. We have dedicated agency programs and funds that work on thematic issues like refugees, women, etc. And the Secretariat is actually dedicated on the UN Charter that supports the Secretary General as the highest UN official, but also the other organs of the United Nations, like the Security Council, the ECOSOC, which is in charge of economic and social issues. And this is very much on our end when we talk about peace issues, and I want to emphasize that high-level diplomacy, something we call track 1 diplomacy. This is like, 20,000 miles above the sea ground. This is very little and rather done by other actors on the ground, conflict resolution. We have special political missions on our end. We have peace operations that engage in different field operations, including here in Colombia. But what I'm going to share from my end is this high-level diplomacy. I want to emphasize that you get this perspective when we talk about peace. We talked about meditation, we talked about the role of nature. So I want to add this kind of very formal diplomatic angle to it. And when we engaged in this a few years ago with the help of Andres, we discovered that a lot of the work that has been done on the peace psychology side would not necessarily fit the international diplomacy field. And there has been very little research done for this high-level diplomacy. Andres helped us to do a study for 6 months. We interviewed God in the world, and we saw that there's really a gap. There's been a lot of stuff done for peace building, community peace building, things we have talked about in the past, but very little when it comes to how do you engage heads of state? How do you engage governments, right? Where we have an agent principle, where people are not people, but they're representing a certain position. And that comes with particular institutional and also cultural challenges. And I want to reflect about this a bit because we haven't covered this yet, I think, sufficiently in the conversation we had in the last 3 days. Okay, so this as background. And also full admission, I'm not a behavioral scientist, so I have a PhD in international law and conflict resolution. I've taught conflict resolution for a long time, but I'm not a trained behavioral scientist. And many of you would not maybe also not define yourself as a behavioral scientist, right? Some have introduced yourselves as economists, for instance, or some of you have said we are coming from the field of medicine. So I found this interesting how this group defined itself. And second anecdote, given that Mary presented, and indeed I would say she has been really the driving ground for behavioral science in the UN system, was our debate about whether we talk about behavioral insights, so a very Americanized policy concept that helps you to think about pro-social choice, or we talk about behavioral science, which is large, and we were also discussing whether we should talk about behavioral sciences in plural, for instance. So on our end, we like to talk about brain and behavioral sciences in plural. So you will see me using this interactively because I feel there's more than just the behavioral aspect to the issues we're trying to achieve and to address. Now, we have a new policy drive with the current Secretary General that launched a policy document that is called Our Common Agenda last year. This is pretty much a response to the mess we see around the world. Climate change was mentioned, but there are so many other policy issues that if you just follow the news, are kind of obvious. And one element of the common agenda is the so-called quintet for the United Nations we want, so UN 2.0. One is an eye on data, second one is on innovation at large and digital transformation, strategic foresight, so how do we deal with uncertainties in a more structured way? COVID has taught us a lot about that. Then results orientation, right? How do we deliver more and better given the limited means we have? And behavior science, which I think relates partly also to the measurement of impact, so that's how we see it, as well as to how do we engineer pro-social choice? How do we make people go to the elections? How do we make people put down their arms and not pick them up again instantly again? How do we make people, be more kind to each other in international negotiations, right? So I wanted to flag that because that's quite recently spelled out as a policy document. And now there's an ongoing debate in the General Assembly among the 193 member states about how would that new common agenda look like in practice when we see constant violence around the world and not really a decrease of international conflicts. And behavioral science is one pattern of that and one element spelled out in an international policy document, which I think is fascinating and gives all of you, I think, on the academic side, a hook to engage with policymakers because governments are now positioning themselves on that very issue. And it gives an entry card to have that conversation. I think when we started with Andres, the guidance was not even launched yet, and we were still talking very quietly about behavioral science. And I'll say a few words about the challenges in that regard in a second. Now, I lead the innovation cell in the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, where we do a lot of things apart from behavioral science as well. Much of this is inspired by new technologies. So we look at social media mining, digital dialogues, where we actually use typical ways of getting a sense for public sentiments, large-scale polling, digital dialogue, so kind of methods you're familiar with as well. We work a lot on geospatial remote sensing. How can you observe water shortage from space, for instance, advanced analytics, speech to text, and other NLP-related issues. Some of you have mentioned that in the last days as well, strategic foresight and human storytelling. Just wanted to tell you that behavioral science is one aspect of the whole innovation portfolio we cover. And interestingly, in some entities of the United Nations, behavioral science would be covered by a separate unit. So I think we will see in the years to come a trend, hopefully, where we have more dedicated resources available in public institutions like the United Nations to make this real, this behavioral science adventure real. We have seen this with a few governments that have created so-called nudge units, right? This was very much popularized by a book, Nudges. And now we've seen a range of regional international organizations responding to that. So again, it's currently housed in innovation, but I think and I hope that in the future we would have actually an army or a cadre of behavioral scientists that would carry out that kind of work. Okay. This came up to my mind yesterday when I was reflecting about all the slides I have to take out of the presentation because you have already talked about them. And I thought, look, nobody has really talked extensively about the role of new technology. And I was thinking that listening to all of you, I was thinking, damn, we're still figuring all this out, how our brain works, right? And there are those new discoveries where we can look into our brain and what is triggered by what, right? And at the same time, we are trying to train machines to act like humans. Isn't that bizarre, right? How are we going to train artificial intelligence if we haven't really figured out how the human brain works? Isn't that a conundrum, right? And are we surrounding ourselves then with technologies that are insufficiently helping or teaching us things that we are insufficiently addressing as well? So this is my academic heart speaking to myself here and to you, just wondering, right? That's the beauty of academia, just wondering, what are we doing here? Like, are we too fast, right? Or are we too slow? Are we too slow in catching up with everything that is currently published and making best use of it? Because I feel often that the jewelries, the kind of the gold nuggets, are still hidden and not really brought to the forefront while we are moving on with many other things. So just wanted to share that as a thought and provoke maybe a reaction. Now, the second thing that came to my mind yesterday is that we haven't really talked about war. I found this fascinating in Colombia. Everybody talks about peace. Nobody really has talked about war here. And I'm saying this with somebody who consciously did civil service in my country. I'm German, as you hear in my accent. We had obligatory military service, as some of you have this in your countries, and I was rejecting that. I said, I cannot kill somebody else. You cannot. I said it was a And you have to write a letter to the government, right, saying that you're not eligible for military. So I said, I'm going to be not a good investment in you. I said, if you train me on the weapon, I cannot shoot somebody, right? And at the same time, and I'm so passionate about peace, I think we have to have an eye on how the military is tackling that. And there's a very strong concept which came up with the insurgencies in Afghanistan, but also Vietnam much earlier. I'm going to show you a historical document which was about winning the hearts and minds, or is about winning the hearts and minds, right? When you occupy, for instance, or when you try to stabilize, right? And this is a strategic choice in military warfare. And I wonder whether, and I like very much that Andres has called this the first international seminar, I wonder whether it's worth to invite some military folks next year and have that conversation, because there's a whole library of handbooks on how the military strategically uses psychology and behavioral science to influence people's choices and win the war, to be for a victory and a defeat, not what we are aiming for in the UN, a compromise, right, with non-violent means. Now, on the military side, you would call those, at least in the American jargon, PSYOPs. So those are psychological operations, right? And you have specialized units for that. So I wish, that's why I said, I wish in the UN we would have a specialized unit. We are just about to have a specialized unit on behavioral science for peace. While the military, for decades, starting in Vietnam and earlier, had military units just for psychological operations. And here I'm just quoting the American handbook for PSYOPs operation that says, psychological operations include psychological warfare, including political, military, economic, and ideological actions. Interesting, we haven't talked so much about ideology here. Planned and conducted to create in neutral, friendly, and non-hostile foreign groups the emotions, attitudes, and behavior, right? So it's a very, very much a tool in the toolbox of the military. And I wonder what we can learn from that. And I wonder who of you here have worked in the military and have advised the military and will advise the current military here in Colombia or in other places to use this for the other side. I'm not saying the dark side, I could provoke you, but I'm saying the other side. I'm saying the other side. And all those trainings videos are all available on YouTube. So what I'm going to show you here is all open source, by the way. So if you want to see what the United States Army thinks about PSYOPs, training videos available on YouTube. Now, at the same time, we face, when we look at political issues, a time where mis and disinformation are very much present. And this is really about the forced industrial revolution, when we think about the use of new technologies and the use of social media, and how mis and disinformation has been, one could say a cancer, right, of political conversations. Because how can you trust what is said on Twitter? And how much can we see this as a social channel where even political leaders are deplatformed from those channels, for instance, or give you an anecdote from the Middle East, where I worked for quite a long time, where for 2 years there was a digital army called a digital army in its Twitter account, and later on one found out it was one dude, 16 years old, in California, running this one-person digital army that created a lot of chaos. So this is a very interesting time we live in, where mis and disinformation are very present, and this is about social choices we make. Participating in those conversations, consuming, but also contributing mis and disinformation. And this is certainly an issue we cover in the United Nations on the policy side, because this has to do with how elections are shaped, how narratives of peace processes are formed, and how we have conversations about the political truth. Now, the UN has engaged on this from the beginning with a campaign that encourages everybody to acknowledge that misinformation is dangerous and to pause, basically, right, before you retweet. Pause before you retweet. Be mindful, so basically to address this in a conscious way. And one of the elements is to be mindful of the emotions that informations aim to trigger in this modern information warfare. It's not called information warfare, I call it like that. But we're pretty much in this mess of information. Now, why does brain behavior science matter in that context? So let me bring this back together for what we do on the diplomatic end when it comes to conflict prevention, mediation, and peace building. And this is pretty much born out of the conversation we had with Andres a few years ago. I think one important thing for us is to predict patterns of irrational human behaviors. And when you think about the current conflicts that are impacting everybody in the world and some irrational choice that were made, right, those can be detected because they deviate from the norm. And that creates a tension. Second part is, for us, critical to unpack habits and mental shortcuts, and that's particularly critical in political negotiations, where we see a recurrent use of habits and mental shortcuts as a strategic choice of the negotiator, for instance. Those who were here among us who were trained as negotiators know that this is not just something we observe, it's something we actively use to manipulate the other side, win over the other side, and win the bargain game. And the third part, and that's, I think, critical in a time where international resources for peace and security are strained, so are limited, scarce, that we need to drive very effective interventions. We don't have endless money to run information campaigns. We don't have endless money to do demobilization programs. So we need to use this as a measure. We need to use behavior science as a measurement tool for the effectiveness of our interventions. So that's why I think you will see, at least from our end, in DPPA and the Department for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, behavior science being used for two things. So again, for creating pro-social choice, but also to measure better the impact and the effectiveness of our interventions. That's not evaluation, right? But it is a constant management of expectations and program deliveries. Okay, now when we started this with Andres, we did a mapping and thought, okay, what's relevant? You know, there's a whole library on behavioral science. What's relevant for peace and security and this kind of, you know, eagle eye height when it comes to diplomacy? And we thought, look, one critical part that comes up again and again in international and policy negotiation is biases and trust building. There's some real actions taking place when you think about where peace processes take place, who comes in as a trusted mediator, for instance, right? How we try to walk each other's journey. There was just I think a political dialogue happening in Cuba for a reason, right? So how do we bring in others to create that trust? So that seems to be an important part of that. Intergroup dynamics, we have spoken about this in the last days already. And then questions of loss aversion, like all the cognitive traps when it comes to, you know, status quo bias are very critical in negotiations. And we figured that a lot of the conversations that we were looking for are actually sitting in the business schools. So we teamed up with professors that are teaching negotiation tactics, because those are the ones that are training the next generation of political leaders that will apply those choices in political negotiations once they are elected. So for us, this is helpful to understand where this comes from in order then to unpack this in political processes that we support. We thought that there are a range of new brain-related discoveries that would be interesting to look at, questions of exclusion, particularly in culturally diverse settings as we operate in the United Nations, so it's always a very diverse setting we work in, particularly the spontaneous eruption of violence, those things that were completely unexpected, right? These are kind of the black swan events, because everything that is kind of visible, okay, that we can deal with, right? That we can predict that to a certain extent, but what leads to the unusual, the irrational behavior? And then things that are related to emotion-focused power imbalances. I'm just going to draw out a picture here that you have seen in the news, where one political leader is sitting at a large table, and the visitors joining his negotiation table sit very far from him or her. I'm not going to reveal who that is. I'm going to leave this to your imagination. And give you a second image where it's about the handshake, right? When do we carry out a handshake? With whom? Why? What kind of human body connection do we want to generate? One of you spoke about this. I think this is fascinating, because this is then about the human touch, literally. So how do we create this in an active way? And to be honest here, when we think about this from the practitioner side, it's not so much new. I've worked on Afghanistan for a while, where we deliberately engineered moments where the conflict parties would interact on the way to the bathroom or on the way to the lunch place, right? So it's not that we haven't done that for a long time, it's just that we are now just putting more resources and more consciousness behind applying behavior science in a structured way in the context of international diplomacy. And one important thing I think that is critical is to see this not just as a solution machine, like an ATM or a Snickers bar machine where you just get the answer out, but we treat this as a continuous process. And I'm not saying this to those among us here who are hardcore academics, but I'm saying this to the practitioners that are maybe watching this or sitting here, because it's often misunderstood as an evaluation exercise where the behavioral science focus group and the measurement comes in the beginning and in the end, but not throughout. So what we are trying to sell inside the house is a behavioral science experiment and process itself. So that's the conversation we had with Mary when the guidance note came out, where we said, look, this is not just about selling better interventions to the communities we are serving and we're supporting, this is also about treating ourselves as a behavioral science project, as the United Nations, as an institution, right? Why is there aversion against science? Why are we not allowed? Not allowed, there's no rule in that, but why is it not common to use your academic title? Why is it not so common to talk about science? Why do we have a conversation to bring science into the dialogue? Why was that nothing natural? So we're pretty much facing a transformation process ourselves, and we're using behavioral science as such. And I'm going to give you an example where we put this into action in a second. And one important point here is the collaboration between the practitioner field, so UN family at large, learning from each other. You had over 1,000 people are part of the behavior science group that Mary manages in the UN Innovation Network, academia, many of you. And I wish I had enough time to read everything you publish. I took so many pictures. I'm happy that most of this is also in English because my Spanish is non-existent. But academia is a critical part of the conversation. The public sector at large, so I talked about the military, right? And the private sector, where a lot of this is used for commercial purposes as well. And I wonder whether this could be an interesting conversation one could have in the years to come. Now, a few case studies from our end to make this more colorful. Let me start with the use of virtual reality. And some of you were there when Gustavo from Gusano Film presented the documentary on the very first day. And we had the pleasure to work with Gusano Film on a piece related to Colombia. And it pretty much started a few years ago when we introduced virtual reality as a communication means to use it for political storytelling in a way where this embodiment of the experience is much more imminent and more intimate at the same time when you watch virtual reality. We did a piece on Iraq to trigger new thinking among decision makers in New York City. Now this became, in the beginning of the year, pretty much real, where 76 years after the creation of the United Nations, we had for the very first time the screening of virtual reality in the Security Council chamber. So don't get me wrong, we have used VR before in the UN years ago, but never as prominently in the Security Council chamber. I see some of you smiling because it looks futuristic, but that's the reality. That was in January, it was on the 14th of January this year, and guess what they were watching? The Colombia experience on the 5 years of the peace process. And those are decision makers that take action related to peace and security that impact on this country here. And some of them have never traveled here. Some of them will never travel here. So we thought the best chance we can give them, apart from a formal briefing that they receive from the special representative of the Secretary General, is a virtual trip to Colombia where they actually hear the voices of the people. Now, this is a 3-episode experience. It's publicly available, so I invite you to go to futureinpeace.org to watch it. You can watch it on YouTube, and if you have a VR device, you can watch it on your VR device. And this is basically bringing together a few voices, not all of Colombian voices, but some voices, to talk about transitional justice, the question of reintegration and security matters. Yeah, and we are now at the point where we're thinking about how do we measure this in a more intelligent way. We did a mini focus group with 17 high-level diplomats. We filmed them, including the Secretary General, and that will be released in a few weeks from now. And we're currently producing a documentary where we do a sample group of Colombians from all shapes of life, watching virtual reality and those different journeys, and responding to what they see, right? Because it is a big place, not everybody travels everywhere, and there are different stories. And what we're thinking about at the moment is, and would love to hear you some thoughts, how do we bring this into a regional dialogue where this could be part and parcel of a conversation with youth, for instance, where, you know, through a virtual way, one could rediscover what family members of certain families in certain regions say. And they can hear it as a podcast, they can see it in the theater, they can read it in a book, they can watch it in 2D documentary, but they could also watch it in virtual reality, where, and that's separately proven by studies, the emotional response, empathy is increased because of the embodiment of the experience, right? So body swaps, there are separate behavior science studies on that. And this kind of technology has become much more affordable than it used to be. So VR devices now are significantly less expensive, and that's why, you know, the opportunities really increased. Now that's one example I wanted to give you when it comes to using behavioral science in the political storytelling context. Second example that we have been working on is to use behavioral science to measure the efficacy of political messaging, so the impact of political messages, right? And this is basically triggered by the what some call, I wouldn't necessarily call, but some call vanilla messages that the United Nations shoots out when it comes to elections. Mostly imperative, go vote because it's your human right. And we thought, why are we not bringing in behavioral science as a way to measure this throughout, before, during, and after elections? And we started basically with machine learning, where we looked at how do press statements of member states look like. And we created a database that is available now online for everybody that basically scrapes all the press statements of 193 member states. So if you look for a term like Ukraine, you find all the official press statements. And that's high-level diplomacy because diplomatic messaging happens through press statements, in the best case. There are some exceptions. There are some member states that, tweet in a less, let's say, mechanical way, and we have seen certain trends in the last 5 years, but otherwise there's a kind of a mechanical way when it comes to political messaging, and that helps us to decode political choices. Now, we did this in a pilot case where we were testing out 3 messages with regard to voter motivation to see what message would stick more, and not just to do this as an evaluation exercise, but to do this throughout the process, and then through basically a standing panel, adjust communication strategies. That, believe it or not, was pretty new for strategic communication in the context of political affairs in high-level diplomacy engagements. And third example relates here to how do we make behavioral science real in our organization. There are a range of documents out there, checklists and guidance. And we thought if we want to treat behavioral science as a true project for ourselves, instead of just feeding checklists and new reports to our colleagues, let's gamify the whole experience. And we were looking around and saw that inoculation theory has been pretty much applied in the context of fighting mis and disinformation. And when Andres came on board, we thought we could do something like a little quiz based on the, Andres, maybe you remember this, the quiz pilot we worked on. I think the next slide I'm going to show you, I think you are not even aware of that yet, which is the Sweet Victory game. And we thought, look, this is very popular. Gamification of inoculation, where you basically experience the other side, and through experiencing the other side, you're much more sensitive to manipulation, for instance, right? And we turned this into a game on behavioral science in the context of peace and security. I'm going to play that clip now, and pretty much inspired by Andres Casas, who is here and has brought us together. There's no sound, so let me play with this.
But good. The world is full of conflict, and it's time to learn from the agents of chaos, not to do bad, but good. Sweet Victory is a game about behavioral science. By putting you into the shoes of the bad guys, you'll learn how to better detect manipulation techniques. The scenario? The year is 2041. You are running a candy factory. Your aim? Sell more candy by creating confusion. Sweets are popular in times of conflict. Just one problem. Your opponent pushes an international agreement that will hurt your profits. You need to turn citizens against them. Here is your arsenal of behavioral science techniques. First, appeal to people's emotions. It's a great way to get them to do what you want. Second technique, nudging. A subtle way of stimulating desired behavior. Handing out free candy could boost your popularity. Now it's time to get rid of your competitors. Target them with disinformation and launch a fake news campaign to amplify your message. Intriguing, right? Play Sweet Victory now to learn about political manipulation and disinformation and become more resilient using the power of behavioral science.
So who would have thought that like 2 years ago? And again, instead of just talking about it, you can experience this. And please use this and provide feedback. We're going to improve the game. Use it in the courses you teach. Play this when you're bored. It takes 3 minutes. The aim is to be really, really naughty, to be very bad, and sell as many candy as you can, and to manipulate your opponents as much as you can, in order to, be mindful of how you get manipulated, right? And that makes you much more sensitive to those issues, and in a fun and gamified, in a light way. Not necessarily less scientific way, but definitely in a light way. Okay, Now, we are currently working on a merger of those different streams that I explained to you, where we basically want to bring together virtual reality, self-reflection opportunities, and all the messiness of choices. So we're working on the creation of a virtual negotiation space that would be a virtual platform for conflict parties to engage with each other in a very neutral and kind of anonymous way whenever needed, but also to provide self-guided experiences for mediators and diplomats in preparation of negotiations, where you can check your biases, where you can discover the other side in an immersive environment. So I've seen top-level mediators meditate, or I've seen yoga class in the context of Libya in London once taking place. You know, you wouldn't believe what had happened to disconnect and reconnect body and mind in international diplomacy. But it has become harder, right? And we have new means at hand. So we're thinking about how can we use new technologies, behavioral science, in a nifty way to create more space for self-reflection. So that's an ongoing project. I wanted to share that with you as well. Now, a few remaining challenges. I'm going to conclude with that. Number one, I think we shouldn't be trapped in a delusion that all problems are behavioral. When you are a constructor, you see a nail everywhere, you want to hammer it in everywhere, right? So I think we need to be mindful that, yes, behavioral science impacts on choices in the context of peace and security, but not everything, or is everything really behavioral? It's like, is everything political? Is everything economic? Question mark. And then there's a reputational risk, I think, for the organization. So we tend not to, at least on our end, we don't talk about experiments so much. We talk about experiences more and approaches. So we wouldn't say the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs is doing an experiment with the conflict parties in Colombia. We would say, you know, there's a support approach. So this can be semantics, but it also pretty much attitude as well, because there's a reputational risk if a peace process becomes a laboratory. Right? So we stay away from this medical approach to treatment. And there are different voices in the organization. So we're having a very heavy debate about that because we have medical colleagues that, you know, turned into political advisors as well. Right? So I want to flag that to you. And then all of this is about, you know, how does it really add value? Is this just nice to have, or is this really need to have to deliver better on our mandate? And is this just mundane at the moment? Because we have a guidance note, and there's a book out there that you can buy at every airport, you know, so that we talk more about behavioral science, and some of you have done this maybe longer than my lifetime, you know, and you wonder, why is this prominent now? So when do we need to jump on this like on this train wagon, and when, you know, now we're keeping a healthy distance from it? And yeah, the last part is really where the sensitivity needs to be acknowledged while we also need to see the benefits, like this balancing act where we consider and engage through pilots and then storytelling about it to learn how this makes sense for our context. Thanks so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Yeah, thanks from my end.